there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today we are pleased to bring you an interview with Professor Ema Ushioda. Ema is the director of the Centre of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick in the UK. Her research interests include language, culture and identity, and particularly motivational perspectives on engaging with different languages and cultures, as well as issues of motivation and autonomy in language learning and their implications for classroom practice and teacher education. She has authored books including Teaching and Researching Motivation with Zoltan Dornyei, and edited books including International Perspectives on Motivation. Rob got the chance to speak to Ema at the 3rd Psychology of Language Learning Conference held at Waseda University in Tokyo earlier this summer. Rob asked questions to Ema about motivation research. We hope you enjoy the interview.
Okay, so this is Rob, and I'm sitting here with Ema Ushioda. Ema, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
You've been giving some talks here at the Psychology of Language Learning 3 conference.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, you were kind of talking about the history of motivation research.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could give a brief sketch of that history,
mm-hmm.
And maybe talk about where your own research fits within that trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I was taking part in a symposium which was to celebrate around 60 years since really when the motivation field in SLA was established, and that was in 1959 with the publication of a seminal article by Robert Gardner and Wallace Lambert, and that really kind of launched the whole field of motivation research. And it was founded in the bilingual context of Canada, where some people speak French and some people speak English, and I think it was in that context where people became interested in sort of issues around attitudes and motivation relating to how you feel about the people who speak the other language, and whether those kinds of attitudes might affect your motivation for learning the language. So these kind of social psychological variables were theorized to influence language learning motivation. So it was in that context, I think, that people became interested in the concept of motivation for language learning. And so that established a field of research called, which has been sort of christened the social psychological tradition of motivation research. And its founding fathers were Wallace Lambert and particularly Robert Gardner. And that was very influential, and still is influential, but particularly influential through the first sort of 30 years, so the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And it was around that time when I had just finished my master's degree in Trinity College in Dublin, and I was looking for a PhD topic. So this was in 1991. So it was around 30 years after the establishment of the field of language motivation research. And there was a kind of perception at that point, I think, that motivation research had kind of reached a sort of peak, and people were perhaps not as interested in the topic as they once had been. And perhaps there was a perception that actually the field had kind of run its course, and maybe something a bit different, something new was needed to kind of put more energy into this area of research again. So at that time, when I was beginning my PhD, I was kind of looking for a new sort of angle into this topic area, because I was interested in motivation. And I suppose what surprised me was that a lot of the research, or nearly all the research in the field, had adopted a quantitative methodology, where the focus is on developing a questionnaire instrument to measure motivation and then to look for statistical relationships with various outcome measures, such as measures of language proficiency and so on. And I suppose what surprised me was that there didn't seem to be that much interest in trying to not so much measure, but more to understand. What is it that motivates people to learn languages? How do they experience that motivation? How do they deal with motivation? Because motivation obviously is not something that's static, but learning a language takes a long time. Your motivation goes up and down. How do you deal with that? So I was more interested in trying to understand motivation from the learner's point of view. And I felt that the only way you could really do that was by adopting a different kind of research approach, something more qualitative rather than quantitative. And so that was what I thought, well, this could be my contribution, if you like, the contribution that a PhD needs to make, to show how by adopting a different kind of method of inquiry, that maybe I could shed a different kind of light on motivation. So that was in the early 1990s, and so I ended up doing a qualitative study of language learners' motivation. But that was also at a time when research, various scholars around the world were kind of expressing the same kinds of issues, the need to broaden the research agenda, the theoretical agenda, beyond the social psychological approach. So during the 1990s, there was a series of papers published in Language Learning and in Modern Language Journal, kind of calling for this, what was subsequently called a motivational renaissance, a broadening of the research agenda. And then that led into adoption of theoretical perspectives from outside the social psychological tradition, theoretical perspectives from mainstream motivational psychology, educational psychology, through the 1990s and into the turn of the century. And then since then, I think one of the most influential, one of the strong influences on our thinking has been the business of English language globalization, the fact that English is now so dominant across the world, everyone has to learn English. And I think this has contributed to shaping our thinking about language learning motivation, because in the traditional social psychological approach, the idea was that if you're motivated to learn a language, it was to do with something with your attitudes to the people who speak the other language in a certain part of the world. But when English is the target language, and in a sense, because English is a global language, it's not necessarily confined to a specific geographical region of the world, because everyone speaks English or can speak English. And so I think that led us to think about kind of re-theorizing motivation, that it's motivation to learn a language might not necessarily be associated with your attitudes towards an external reference group so much, but might be more to do with your kind of relationship to English as a global language, and whether you see yourself perhaps as a member of that global community. So it's kind of a process of internalizing motivation in terms of your perceptions of self, your identity, whether you see yourself as a global citizen or not. And so currently, the current thinking around language learning and motivation is very much framed in terms of those self and identity perspectives.
Right. You mentioned earlier that motivation is part of SLA. So within SLA, there are, I guess, a few different schools of thought, the kind of the cognitivist thing, the socio-cognitive, the socio-cultural. Where does motivation fit in within those areas?
Yes, that's a very good question. We see traditionally, motivation actually, the birth of motivation as a field kind of predates SLA. Because I think SLA, most people associate its origins with the 1960s and early 1970s, particularly I think the founding fathers of Pitt Corder, his paper in the 1960s, and then Larry Salinker, his paper in 1972. And I think that's when the sort of birth of mainstream SLA is kind of identified as being at that time, whereas motivation research goes back really to, as I say, 1959, the early 1960s. So it kind of predates it. And because motivation is considered an individual difference variable, so it is very much, I think, considered more within the, I suppose, as a cognitive variable, because it's to do with, your self-perceptions and attitudes and so on. But also because of Gardner's work, he was a social psychologist, and because motivation is also therefore associated with your attitudes to the social context, people, different communities around you. So it's very much kind of situated in that social context. So in some senses, it kind of, I suppose, straddles the cognitive and the socio-cultural to some extent. And I think that's increasingly become the case, because even in mainstream psychology, this view of motivation as being something that's not solely situated within the individual, but in that interaction between the individual and the social, has also become very, very prominent.
Right. Yeah. So another thing that I think you mentioned yesterday was the kind of the time gap between interest in motivation research. There was maybe like a kind of a 10-year gap from 1995 to about 2005. Is that right?
Something like that.
Yeah. So one of our previous interviewees, Jeff Jordan, he said that his MA students, one of the big topics that seems to be gaining interest is interest in motivation. And the reason he gave for that was because maybe from a student's point of view, if you can figure out motivation, then you've kind of cracked the process of language learning.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think there's any truth in that, or what's your perspective on that?
You mean in terms of why it attracts MA students, or why it attracts...
Well, I guess why it attracts MA students, and in general why there's been an uptick in research.
I think in terms of why the topic attracts MA students, I think one of the reasons may be that because there is a very, very well-defined kind of research approach to investigating motivation. Essentially, you develop a questionnaire to assess people's motivations, and that yields data that then you can analyse and consider whether that explains whether motivation shapes language proficiency and so on. There's a kind of very standard research design. And so for that reason, I think in some ways it can attract MA sort of master's level students, because it already presents for them not necessarily an easy, but a kind of well-recognised research design that they can easily adopt and design the questionnaire or adapt a questionnaire, collect lots of data, analyse it and write it up. So I think that might be one reason why it attracts MA students. In a sense, it's quite easy to do that kind of motivation study.
Right.
The difficulty is that at master's level, it's perhaps not so easy to do a study of this kind that is really interesting. Because questionnaire type data on a relatively small scale tends to yield fairly superficial data, and it doesn't necessarily lead to really interesting findings, I suppose. But going back to the other question about, if you understand motivation, if we research motivation, maybe motivation is, in some senses, the answer to everything, so to speak. I'm not sure whether that is the case, because I think even if you have very motivated students, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be all plain sailing for them, because as we know, learning a language takes a lot of time. It's a long and complex process, and there might be also various other competing demands, competing motivations that you have. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you can understand how motivation works and how to motivate your language learners, so that's therefore going to be the answer to everything. But I do think it's important as teachers that we do our best to try to understand our students' motivations and what attracts them to the language, to the process of learning the language, and what perhaps doesn't attract them, what kinds of motivations they bring to that situation. I think it's really important that we try to understand that, rather than simply assume that we know, because often we don't.
Right. I wonder what the relationship is then between understanding a student's motivation and maybe trying to encourage their motivation. Because it seems, for example, in Japan that a lot of students are extrinsically motivated. They have exams and, they're not really interested in the language itself. Is it a teacher's job to try and establish some intrinsic motivation, or is it more a teacher's job to understand the motivations that the students already have and then kind of tailor their lessons towards that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think obviously, research evidence, not just in SLA but in education in general, shows that intrinsic motivation is the gold standard. It's the sort of most desirable type of motivation that we would want our students to have, because there is a lot of research evidence to show that intrinsic motivation is very strongly associated with not just good, end results and so on, but with high quality learning. Because when you're intrinsically motivated, it means that you're motivated to do something really well. That's what gives you the intrinsic motivation, the pleasure and so on. So it promotes very high quality engagement in learning. So obviously it's the kind of motivation that we would want our students to have, but it's not something that we can, externally impose on people. It's got to be something that, comes from within them.
Right.
So it's not necessarily that we should, as teachers, try to, to aim to nurture intrinsic motivation as the only type of motivation. I think it's important that we, as I was saying earlier, to try to understand how students feel about learning a language, about learning English, whether they have things that interest them or not, because I think we want to try and build on people's interests and any kind of personal interests that may connect them with learning English. And if their focus, if the students' focus is much more on exams, they see that, they feel that they're only learning English in order to pass the exam, to get to the next stage of their education, then I think we've also got to respect that, because in some senses what we need to do is to try to help our students as best as possible to get to the next stage. And if we can do that in a way that also helps to promote their intrinsic motivation, well and good. But if they are not interested, say, in enjoying English, they simply want to get to the next stage, then I think as teachers we need to respect that and help them as much as possible to do that.
I agree. It's something I think that's very common in ELT. Teachers kind of assume what's best for the students. I think it's kind of a mentality we need to get beyond in some way.
I think so. I mean, I know that Stephen Ryan has made that comment himself, that, in some senses, is it ethical to try as a teacher sort of to, try and entertain the students and trying to do as much as possible to make things as motivating as possible, and in some senses perhaps use up a lot of class time trying to make English motivating and fun and interesting, whereas actually all the students are interested in doing is actually learning enough English so that they can pass the exams and get to the next stage, and they don't necessarily want all this motivational paraphernalia going on. And I think we've got to respect that.
Right. Well, I think that leads us on to the topic of your second talk yesterday quite nicely about who does motivation research serve, like who is it for, really?
Yes.
So you were talking about, the different groups that are maybe served by, like academics, institutions and learners. To what extent do you think motivation research actually does benefit learners in a concrete way?
I think it's a difficult one. I think it really depends on how shall I put it? I think traditionally the benefits for language learners was not really uppermost in our minds as researchers, as scholars. I think we were much more interested in simply trying to understand and explain the role of motivation in language learning, and it was a much more kind of theoretical interest in motivation. I think in terms of actually trying to help language learners, in other words, developing insights from that then we could apply to the language classroom, I think that's something that we could really do a lot more, I feel. Yes, from the findings that we get from our research, we can develop certain implications for pedagogy, so to speak. But often these are kind of, if you look at research papers and so on, often it's kind of just a little paragraph at the end of the paper, implications for pedagogy, which is kind of conventional and standard, but and sometimes they're actually quite superficial recommendations that you see.
Right.
And so I kind of feel that there's a lot more that we can do to try to actually shape our research in a way that's much more focused on trying to help learners to manage their own motivations.
Right.
Yeah.
So is that the direction that you would like the research agenda, I guess, to take?
I think so. In other words, for example, thinking about language learners but also teachers, I think what often tends to happen is that traditionally it's us researchers that come up with our research questions, and then we look for, okay, how am I going to get the data to explore these questions, and then we negotiate with a teacher in a classroom, we fly into the classroom and collect our data or do some interviews, and then kind of fly out again and analyse our data and report them and so on. I think what I would like to see more of is perhaps that actually we start off before we develop our own research questions is maybe to talk to the teachers, the learners, the people who are involved in that process, to actually find out from them what the issues are from them. And maybe, as I was saying in my talk yesterday, to think of the teachers, the learners, not so much as subjects or objects or even participants in our research, but perhaps as the agents of our research, and that it's their research questions or their research problems or pedagogical problems that we then as researchers then collaborate with them to help them to try to improve their own practice, or as teachers or as learners, and that we can shape our research in a way to help them to improve their own lives. Right. That's, I think, what I would like to see more of, because I think motivation ultimately, as scholars, if we're interested in motivation, then I'm assuming that our ultimate goal is to try to enable those who are engaged in the business of language learning and teaching to manage their own motivations, or to help their students to manage their motivations.
Right. Kind of I think an emic rather than an etic view, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Another term that came up yesterday was the social utility of motivation research. Is there a difference in your mind between the social utility and the benefit for learners? Is the social utility something broader, or is it kind of the same thing?
I think the benefit for learners, to me, is kind of non-controversial. I think it's very clear. I think social utility, the word utility, I think has kind of positive and negative connotations, because I think the danger with the idea of utility, it connects with me the idea that, this utilitarian or instrumentalist view of language learning or language education, the idea that's obviously very popular now, that, we need to promote language skills or global skills for the workplace, that kind of thing, this very kind of instrumentalist view of education. And so when we think about social utility, I think there is for me, the danger that it becomes very, very narrowly defined in that sense. So I think I prefer the idea of benefits, that we are engaging in research that has some kind of social benefit for the people who kind of will, gain from our research.
Right. And you mentioned as well several sort of dominant frameworks of motivation. So I know that you've written about the person in context relational view of motivation. Could you describe that kind of briefly? Briefly. As briefly as you can.
So, yes, I developed this idea of the person in context because within the SLA field, especially within motivation research, there's always been a tendency simply to focus on language learners as language learners. And often, when we read papers or write papers, we just define them as L2 learners or learners, as if they are one-dimensional and that all that they're doing in life is learning a language. And we forget that they're complex people. They'll be doing lots of other things, learning other things, but doing other things in their lives. And I kind of felt that we need perhaps to stand back from that and not treat them simply in this one-dimensional way, but to think of them as people, complex people, for whom learning a language, learning a second language, happens to be one part of their lives, but they might not necessarily see themselves as L2 learners. They might see themselves, in very different ways, and they just happen to be engaged in learning a language as well. So that's why I prefer a focus on people or persons in that holistic sense, rather than labeling them as L2 learners. But also, of course, because they're people or because we're people, we can't really just be taken out of the context. We're not just a decontextualized bundle of variables, as we tend to treat L2 learners in our research. And because we are part of a context, but we also very much contribute to that context. We shape that context. It's very much a kind of interactive relationship that we have with our context. And by context, I don't just mean physical context or cultural context, but it could also be temporal context. We have a past, we have a future, we have a present. It could be virtual. We're connected in so many ways, physically and virtually. And these contexts are constantly evolving and changing. So I kind of feel that it would be much more meaningful for us to explore motivation, focusing on persons in context, rather than decontextualized L2 learners.
Do you think there are any difficulties in taking that kind of approach? So one thing that I've noticed with my own students when they're doing research projects is that they talk about their participants and they say, male, mid-20s or female, whatever. And then that never comes up again. So I guess how do people know which variables about their learners they should pay attention to if they want to engage in research, or even I guess as a teacher if they're thinking about their students in this way? How can they kind of work through that?
I guess it depends on what type of research they're doing and what sorts of methods that they're using. But I think, because I always advocate qualitative research approaches, and so with qualitative research approaches, I think we're always looking for rich data, so that when we engage with our participants, so to speak, that we are looking at not just their responses to particular tick box type questions, but we're looking really to see how the issues that we are interested in, connect with things in their experiences and their lives that are relevant to those issues, motivation, if we're looking at motivation. So, maybe it's something in their past experiences or in their social relations and so on that might connect with their current motivation, say, for learning English. So I think it's really through those kinds of open-ended qualitative methods of inquiry that we can get some kind of insight into the wider experiences and social contexts of those people that might impinge on their motivations.
Right. Yeah. So maybe on the topic of qualitative research, so I'm a qualitative researcher myself, and of course one criticism that often gets levelled at qualitative research is that it's not generalizable. Kind of what's the point? It's just relative. I mean, what do you say to that in terms of motivation research? If you're researching one learner or a group of learners, how does that benefit beyond learning about that person or that group?
I think when we talk about generalizability, yes, of course, if you're focusing just on a small group of people or one or two learners or case studies and so on, clearly we're not looking to generalize to a wider population. But I think what we can talk about is generalizability to theory rather than to a population.
Right.
So that, we are often looking to explore and understand a particular set of issues. And so through our rich analysis of a single case or a few cases, a few people who are engaged in learning a language, we can theorize, and then move from that maybe then to exploring those issues with another sample, so to speak. So the idea is that we would generalize to theory rather than generalize to population.
Right.
But also then, because of the hopefully the richness of the insights that we get from the in-depth qualitative analysis that we do, we can also, the idea is that those findings, as we write them up, might then also, I think the word that's often used is resonate with other people, other teachers who work with similar types of students and so on. So I think we would talk about using different terms, so not generalizability so much, but maybe resonance might be, one term that we would use.
Okay. So maybe for one final question, so maybe in the spirit of social benefits, a lot of the listeners to this podcast are teachers. So what kind of takeaway message would you like to give to teachers about motivation, or about what they can do in terms of understanding the motivation of their students?
Takeaway message. Well, I think obviously teachers are best positioned to understand the motivations of their students, much more well positioned than, say, researchers coming from outside, because teachers who are working with a group of students, they know their students and they get to know their students, better over the course of study. I think what will be really important is to, as a teacher, certainly as a teacher, I always want to do this, is to try to get to know my students individually, try to understand where they're coming from, and try to understand what motivates them and what doesn't motivate them. Because I think as teachers sometimes we make the assumption that we know what our students like and don't like, and I think it's not safe to make those assumptions. So I think to find ways, whether it's through discussion activities, whether it's through kind of inviting our students maybe to write a little bit about themselves, a kind of language learning history, that type of thing, to use these kinds of approaches to find out about our students as individuals, I think is always useful. And I think students also appreciate that, because then they will also see that as teachers we take interest in them as individual people, rather than treating them simply as, faces around the classroom.
Right. I think that's a nice place to end the interview. So, Ema Ushioda, thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening today. We hope you enjoyed the interview. We'd also like to say a big thank you to Professor Ema Ushioda for agreeing to be interviewed with us. We'd also like to say thank you to Professor Stephen Ryan, one of the organisers of the Psychology of Language Learning Conference at Waseda University, for allowing us to conduct our interviews there. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send us an email at TEFLology@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. You can like us on Facebook, rate and review us on iTunes, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes at TEFLology-podcast.com. So thanks again, and we'll be back again soon.